And we're live with Preston So. Preston So, thank you very much for making the time. And you are a very busy man, and so I appreciate you putting some time apart to speak with me on Lingofest. I appreciate it. Um, so so I want to spend a good chunk of our time talking about your interest in voice and conversational design. And you recently published a book, so I want to talk about that as well. And congratulations! I have read it. I bought the ebook version of it because I wanted to make sure I had read it before the interview. But I am a guy who likes paper books, so it's on its way. So before we go there, you are currently Senior Director of Product at Oracle. Why don't we spend just a little bit of time to tell the audience what you do there for a living, and then we can then shift into the world of voice and conversational design?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Ahmed. And, I definitely have a very multifaceted career professionally. My day job, so to speak, is I work on Oracle Content Management, which is Oracle's content management system, overseeing everything related to developer experience, developer relations, our headless content management strategy, open source strategy. But that's only one very, very small piece of what I do in my day-to-day kind of life. I also do a lot of writing and a lot of work for other outlets as well. I'm a columnist for CMS Wire. I'm an editor at A List Apart magazine. I've also contributed to Smashing magazine, and I also write a lot on my blog, Preston So. And the work that I do really is at the nexus and the intersection between content architectures, how we actually implement how content gets delivered, and content design and content strategy. And that's where a lot of the work that I've done around voice content and looking at how we can deliver content to voice interfaces comes into play. But I've had a very serpentine career. I started out as a programmer in 1999. Been a web designer, web developer since 2001, so 20 years in the business. Before that, I was in print work and print design. I've been a content architect and content management specialist since 2007. I've been also a designer of voice interfaces since 2016. And I've also, of course, worked in a variety of different teams across the worlds of product and design and engineering and innovation. So I definitely have seen my way around the block when it comes to organizations that are delivering digital experiences, especially those that have to do with voice content.
Definitely, you're let's call you a Renaissance man, a man of many hats. That's great. Let's spend a little bit of time on your writing and editing work, because I think it's fascinating that and probably it explains your attraction to conversational design, because there's a lot of care for language when somebody designs a highly usable voice conversation, right? And it looks like language is a very important part of your life. So you are editor at A List Apart. Is it something that you launched a few months ago, or was it something that's been around? Not sure.
Well, A List Apart magazine has been around for many, many years.
Many years. Okay.
It started in the late 90s, actually. And it's a basically an industry magazine for web designers, web developers, user experience specialists, usability researchers, accessibility advocates and researchers. And I just recently joined the editorial board. I've written actually several articles for them about voice and about immersive experiences. And they're very well known in the worlds of both web and content strategy. Maybe not so much in the world of voice, which is a very interesting world in that it straddles so many different disciplines at this point, and there's a lot of different silos in terms of information and communities out there.
Definitely, yeah. And I think one of the interesting things that one can do, like yourself and folks who are, who have dipped into multiple, let's call them bubbles or worlds, is to connect those bubbles, is to create bridges between them, because there's a lot of learning that can be done, I think, between them. Like, for example, I think there's a lot of stuff from linguistics that is just, it's just rich stuff out there that even us folks who are in the voice design are not exposed to it as much as we should, and vice versa. I think there's a lot of linguistics folks who don't know what's going on in the world of voice design. So, whenever I see these bridges, I'm very heartened. And so, for me, and the reason why I reached out to you is you seem to be that kind of a guy, right? You understand the world of designing visual, and you understand the world of designing, the conversational interface. And so you see things that somebody who lives in one or the other bubble exclusively wouldn't see, like similarities and patterns and all that. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that in terms of what are the differences between designing for the tactile and the visual and designing for voice, and what are the similarities? I'm sure there are things to say on both of those tracks.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ahmed. And what I'll do is I'll start by saying that there's certainly a lot of commonalities between the realms of voice interface design and visual, or as you say, tactile design, when it comes to interaction design. And that really comes into play when you think about the fact that every user experience is designed. Every user experience has to involve some sort of writing. Every user experience has to involve some sort of information delivery or some sort of information transfer. And this is one of those things that I think is at the root of both, voice experiences, immersive experiences, user experiences for the web, mobile devices. All of that is built on top of this foundation of really being rooted in how we transmit information, how we conduct transactions on the user's behalf. Now, of course, how those mechanisms happen and how those dynamics actually surface is where things get very interesting. And one of the things I always like to tell people who are getting into voice interface design, getting into conversation design, is that you really have to focus on the notion, and this is something Erica Hall writes quite a bit about in her book, Conversational Design. You really have to focus on the notion that in terms of voice and in terms of some of the really spoken media user experiences that we're talking about, the primary axis that you operate on is time, not space. With the web, with websites, with mobile devices, it's still a very tactile experience. It's a visual experience. It's a visual sandbox. And with the oral equivalent of that, or a verbal equivalent of that, you really don't have the luxury of putting together what are called, documents or pieces of information in space, because you're holding people in suspense. You're not able to actually transmit a large amount of information in a very short amount of time in the same way you would in space. However, one thing I will say is that I think that, notwithstanding, of course, the fact that there are very, very crucial differences and critical distinctions that need to be drawn between spoken conversational interfaces and written conversational interfaces like chatbots and the like, it's really important to recognize that at the end of the day, a lot of our user experiences are really important in terms of writing them, right? We write help text in our user interfaces for the web. We write certain text when it comes to our brand voices, when it comes to our digital experiences otherwise that are off voice. And creating a voice interface is just, in some ways, a step beyond the kind of interface writing that we've already had to do. There's a lot of interesting work being done right now, for example, in the technical writing space, and how we actually write these user interfaces in ways that make sense. For spoken interfaces, like voice interfaces, it becomes a very, very different calculus and a very, very different kind of writing from those that we're used to. So one of the things that I am very excited about with voice interface design is how a lot of those designers who might not get to actually, exercise that writing muscle very often, really have to do that in a voice context, because there's no other way to transmit information. There's no other way to actually conduct transactions, because some of the affordances and some of the tenets of visual interaction design are simply unavailable. There is no way to color text blue and underline it. There's no way to create a drop shadow on a button. There's no way to suggest that there are these things that exist, because you're operating in a fully oral and verbal medium. And for that reason, my book actually focuses solely on pure voice interfaces, what we call pure voice interfaces, meaning voice interfaces that don't have a visual equivalent or a physical kind of manifestation, which means they're less accessible, but it also means that they have a lot of interesting challenges for us as designers and as those who work in interaction design.
Wonderful, wonderful. Let me double click on what you just said, one of the key words that you just said, which is less accessible. and see what you think about this thought that I have, which is interfaces can be evaluated only against a use case, right? So you have an interface, let's say tactile, visual, where you can swipe and all, and you have one where you can only hear and speak, right? In the right circumstances, the first one is better than the second one, and vice versa, right? So, for instance, if I am preparing food, and this is the classic example, and I just want to find out what time does the post office close today, it is a far superior experience for me to just ask my Echo, when does the post office close, right? So in that sense, right, that experience is superior to the experience where I have to, wash my hands because I was cooking some chicken, and then I have to go to my laptop or my smartphone and just look and type and all that, which is very disruptive to the flow, right? So I think that's one thing that is missed. And in your book, I think you do a good job at making sure that people get that, right? That is missed, that they say, the pure voice interface is inferior, as if it were these ideals and they exist and they have certain properties and so on. When in fact, to evaluate an interface, you always have to talk about the use case. You cannot evaluate without use case. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I think those who say that pure voice interfaces are inferior are really, in some ways, I think, missing the point of what and I think you would agree with this, Ahmed, is the notion of multimodal user experiences, and the fact that we're not just using one device anymore. And one of the things that I'll share is that with pure voice interfaces in particular, I think one of the biggest issues that we often forget is that it's not meant to be something that is a replacement for or a substitution of the interfaces that we have. It's an additive mechanism. It's voice interface adds to the milieu and the constellation and the kaleidoscope of all of the different user interfaces that we should be interacting with. And there's no better illustration of this, in my opinion, than thinking about the ways in which disabled communities interact with our devices. Voice interfaces, for example, yes, if you're a deaf person or a deaf-blind person, voice interfaces are actually not usable at all. And that is an inferior experience, because if you don't have an alternative to that voice interface, then you are suddenly excluding a huge demographic from your user base and the use cases that you mentioned. So what I think is really important to keep in mind is that we need to have a holistic and a comprehensive understanding of what it is that our users are looking for or what they want to be using when it comes to these interfaces. And one really good illustration of this, right, is that I think one of the biggest issues that a lot of people coming from the web side of things, right, and I think that's nowadays we see a lot of people who are very well versed in web technologies, web design, web development, beginning to dip their toes in the voice. But we've been so biased towards the web for so long that a lot of web designers and a lot of web developers have been caught in this tunnel vision, and they think the website is the end-all be-all medium, and there's no, let's say, better approach than the website. But you've seen in my book, for example, that the screen reader for websites is really not ideal. It's not an optimal experience. And what we found is in our project for the state of Georgia, the Ask Georgia Gov Alexa skill, we found that there is a completely different set of expectations that Alexa users who are more likely to be using Alexa have that are completely unaccounted for in the website. And that's borne out through several pieces of evidence. Number one, the kinds of topics that people would ask about on Alexa were completely different from those that people would search for on the website. And the audiences that were using the Alexa skill were very different as well. Our Alexa skill attracted those who were elderly Georgians who might have a smart speaker at home, might have Alexa at home, but they might not necessarily feel as comfortable using a website because, as you said, that requires you to go and use a mouse and use a keyboard, which are both things that might not actually be so easy for elderly or for disabled Georgians to use.
That's right.
So a lot of these considerations, I think, have to be couched in this notion that we are no longer in an environment where it's just a transition from one realm to another, one domain to another. For example, the transition from print to web. That was a one-to-one transition, right? True. The transition from desktop to mobile or tablet, right? Like, we thought of that as a one-to-one. But we are in a situation now, and I call this the channel explosion on my blog, but we are in a situation right now where we're moving from one, which is web, to many different experiences and many different user experiences that all have different expectations of how interaction designers should work and how the users interacting with them want to be able to use these devices, and how those affordances should look, and how those affordances should perform. So I think one of the very interesting things that I find about some of the, let's say, the opposition to voice interfaces. I mean, there is certainly valid opposition about the fact that, where's the money, where's the value in this? There's, it's not really adding that much to our existing properties. But I think those who would argue that it's an inferior experience really need to spend some time thinking about these other lived experiences and other demographics that have been, in many cases, swept aside by or even ignored by the traditional website.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of our clients here, I work, the company that I work at and head is Witlingo, and we work with the ARP Foundation, and so we deal with lots and lots of seniors, and there are use cases that you couldn't imagine, right? At all, right? They wouldn't even go near their desktop because of various reasons, right? Whether they can't use them or they can't afford them, right? You can afford to get yourself a hockey puck, right? A dot, and if you have Wi-Fi, you're all set. But buying a PC is expensive, and that's an issue for a lot of people. In addition to all of the issues of accessibility and all that, and what is interesting is that, like you said, right, it is enabling us to do more things more easily, right? So the example that I gave you, where you're preparing food or you are talking with somebody, and all of a sudden you have a question about what was the score yesterday between the nationals, and right, so you just ask, and the flow of the conversation continues, eye contact continues, right? Those little things are not little things; they are actually important things because they allow for the flow to go on. So I think I think like you say, the existence of all these modalities, and also our expectations, I think, where we want to be doing things with technology almost all the time now, right? It used to be in the office, way back, right? You do technology in the office, maybe at home. Now everywhere you want to be doing something. The watch, you have the watch, and you have the smart speaker, and so on. So it is an addition to the set of tools that we have. So the writing is a crucial part of your life, which is great, and I think it explains the thoughtfulness that you have about the interface, the language interface, the human language interface, both written as well as spoken. And there are differences, obviously, between the way we talk to a robot and the way we talk to a robot by typing and speak. One thing I wanted to touch on, which you did touch on, is in the book, page 115 it was. Let me just, page 115, yeah. You talk about something interesting that I want to have the audience have you riff on, if you could, is the notion of conversational singularity. Right? What does that mean? What is that? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, chances are a lot of us have heard of the technology singularity or the AI singularity, right? Which is where, at some point we'll have technology that's so advanced where artificial intelligence will be indistinguishable from a human behind the curtain. And it's the whole classic mechanical Turk, problem back in the day. The conversational singularity is something that a gentleman named Mark Curtis refers to as that equivalent for conversational interfaces. And I really prefer to focus on voice interfaces because I think they're the more interesting for this particular topic, which is that, it's this notion that having a conversation with Alexa is going to eventually be as, natural and organic as the kind of conversation you and I are having right now, Ahmed. And I think that's a very interesting kind of idea. But it's also a very challenging idea, and there's two reasons for that, right? The first reason is that there's a bit of a predilection right now within voice interfaces, especially those that are driven by organizations that are creating custom Alexa skills or creating custom Google Home assistants that create these arbitrary lines in the sand, right? So if you think about, for example, let's take your example of the Nationals, right? The Nationals might have an Alexa skill that can answer any conceivable question about what you want to know about the Nationals. But as soon as you want to ask about something that's outside of the jurisdiction of or outside the purview of that particular voice interface, suddenly now you have to exit out and go back to the main global Alexa interface and re-enter or go into some different mode of speaking. And so I think the conversational singularity as a concept is in many ways diametrically opposed to the ways in which we are building conversational interfaces today, which are generally speaking tied to a single brand, tied to a single purpose, tied to a single value proposition, tied to a single set of use cases. And as soon as you venture beyond that existing menagerie of options that you have available to you, it suddenly becomes a very, very different kind of problem. And there's several authors that have written on this. One, of course, is lots of people have cited this book, the Studies in Conversational UX Design, Robert Moore, Raphael Arar, and Guangjie Ren, who really talk about this notion of why are there these arbitrary boundaries, these lines in the sand between the different functional coverages of these voice interfaces. Why is it, for example, that I can't ask a Nationals Alexa skill about how to order pizza from this place that's down the corner, or why can I not look up, let's say, a topic that is not related to the Nationals whatsoever? So I think it's very interesting because they do this taxonomy. They classify different voice interfaces, conversational interfaces, and one of those in particular that they refer to as content-centric is one that I believe is the closest to, let's say, the realm of voice content that I've operated in over the years. But the one that they really want to kind of be behind and support and encourage people to stick to is, of course, the one that's the most challenging, and the one that is the paradigm that is probably the most unachievable or unattainable for those who are working in organizations that don't have, let's say, a whole team just working on machine learning and natural language processing and natural language generation. And that is what they call conversation-centric design, which goes right into the core of what it means to be a conversational, an interface that enables a conversational singularity event, which is that, you should be able to ask an Alexa skill, right, any conceivable question, and weave in and out of these different topical areas and never get to a situation where you're going to encounter any sort of friction or any sort of out of domain error or any sort of these arbitrary quote unquote issues that shouldn't necessarily be part of a voice interface at all.